West Virginia Governor Patrick Morrisey met with state leaders today to talk about the issues facing the state ahead of the next legislative session. Morrisey didn't share any details about particular pieces of legislation that he wants to see the legislature prioritize. Speaking generally, the governor, Speaker of the House of Delegates Roger Hanshaw, and Senate President Randy Smith said they want to prioritize economic development and attracting businesses to West Virginia. The governor also said that he wants to set a standard for collaboration and communication between his administration and the legislature going forward.
It's our intent to have a very strong working relationship with the legislature, to be able to collaborate on so many different initiatives, perhaps to be able to identify the first 20, 25 bills we're at the outset we're going to have some agreement on, and then we get to advance them and to really make meaningful progress for our state.
Senate President Randy Smith said it's refreshing to have a governor who wants to bring the legislature and the executive branch together. The 2025 legislative session begins on February 12th.